Rusty Quill presents the Magnus Archives. Episode 45, Blood Bag.
Statement of Thomas Neal regarding his experiences working in malarial research during the spring of 2010. Original statement given February the 9th, 2011. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, Head Archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I hope you'll forgive the handwriting. The shaking has gotten better over the last few months, but it's still quite hard to read. Also, my therapist has recently changed up my medication, so if I get a bit muddled, that's why. Just to be clear, my medication and treatment have been in response to the events I'm describing here. I was not taking any drugs before or during the event I'm setting down. I only started my treatment course after Neil's death. I've been working as a research assistant for about 6 years now. Anyone who tries to sell you the career with promises of money, fulfillment, or grand discoveries is a liar. The work is long and repetitive. The discoveries will be credited to the fellows, at least until they're disproved or irrelevant 5 years down the line, and the money is, the money is actually not too bad. At least not until the grant dries up halfway through the project. I guess what I mean to say is that when I finally managed to get on a project doing something I really believed in, I was prepared to overlook a lot. It was malaria research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I was working under Dr. Neil Thompson. I'm pretty sure he hired me just because of how similar our names are, Thomas Neal and Neil Thompson. There was always a little moment of confusion whenever anyone asked for Neil. I think he got a kick out of it. That's the sort of person he was. Not mean-spirited or nasty. He just liked a bit of harmless chaos now and again. Balanced out his precision in the lab, I suppose, because in there he was the sort of rigorous, meticulous scientist I didn't think existed outside of fictional medical dramas. Put it like this. He wore a white lab coat and it was always immaculate. I don't know if you realize how genuinely impressive that is working in a lab, especially given as our work was messy. Very messy. We weren't working on malaria directly, you understand. Our work was on the Anopheline mosquitoes themselves, transmission capable, but not infected. Though you'd hardly know by the reaction if one got loose. We're talking panicked, fleeing, lockdown and trained staff coming in to kill the thing. I always used to think that level of caution was ridiculous given our mozzies didn't actually have malaria. Not so much anymore. We were trying to synthesize a sort of blood substitute, a combination of the sugars and proteins that the mozzies need to survive, but one that was more enticing than a human full of blood. The idea was to create a lure of sorts, which would keep the mosquitoes concentrated away from people and could potentially be used to poison them, though that bit was some ways in the future. At this point, most of the research was spent trying to perfect the taste of the thing, for lack of a better term. The smell was also a big factor, as we needed the mozzies to choose it as a source of protein over a human. And as it progressed, it turned out that the texture and composition of the feeding bag itself helped attract them. So it ended up getting more and more like human skin. The later bags even had little bits of human hair embedded into them, which made the whole thing several shades too grotesque for me, but the mozzies went mad for it. And as far as Neil was concerned, that's all that mattered. After about 6 months, we had pretty much perfected it, to be honest. We had a lure bag that the mozzies preferred over a human sample in 98% of cases, and which they consistently demonstrated a willingness to return to over alternatives. The issue was the cost. Our synthesized blood substitute, which we liked to call hemoglobish, was simply not cheap enough for mass production, especially considering the bag requirements, and and as we were dealing in prevention rather than cure, we were always going to be compared to the cost-effectiveness of just buying a boatload of mosquito nets. And that wasn't going to be a comparison where we came out on top. We kept going, though, trying to recreate the effect with cheaper, more easily available materials. But that was when Neil first started muttering darkly about funding. Here's where I should probably say a bit about Neil's syringe. Now, our Dr. Thompson claimed to be descended from the 19th century physician John Snow, a great-great-nephew or a great-great-great-grandson or something like that. I'm not sure how much you know about epidemiology in the 1850s, and it's certainly a common enough name, but Snow was pivotal in laying the groundwork for the germ theory of disease transmission and is widely credited with helping end the cholera outbreak of 1854. I only bring this up because Neil had, well, I suppose you could call it something of a totem. It was an old Victorian syringe, which he claimed had belonged to this illustrious ancestor of his. I don't know if it was true or not, but Neil certainly treated the thing like a relic. He kept it in excellent condition, with glass shining and brass polished, and would carry it around in a small case tucked into his lab coat pocket. Whenever he was called upon to do any calculations or look over results, his hand would slip into that pocket, and he'd gently clutch that case. So you can imagine that it came as something of a surprise when he came to me and asked for my help in selling it. Now, according to Neil, our project's grant money had run out, and without alternative sources of funding, we weren't going to be able to continue the work. I'm not sure how much I believed him, as the word around the lab was Neil had something of a gambling habit. In fairness to him, I'd heard all sorts of baseless gossip flying around about everybody, and honestly don't know how the money worked for our project. I'd just signed the contract and took the paychecks. It never occurred to me to investigate our funding myself, so he might have been telling the truth. He might have been trying to save the project. It didn't really matter, as by this point Neil and I were quite close, so if he asked me to do him a favour, I wasn't exactly going to refuse. When I say he asked for my help selling it, that's not exactly accurate. He'd already found a buyer, some antiques dealer who Neil said had offered him 6 figures for it. That sounded mad to me. I mean, it was a valuable trinket, sure, but that's all that it was. Neil didn't seem entirely convinced the guy was on the level either, which was why he asked me to come along. I'm a big guy, 6'7", 14.5 stone, so I can cut a pretty intimidating figure if I need to, especially if you don't know that I've never thrown a punch in my life. That's what Neil wanted me to do. Just be there, have his back while he went to meet this guy, so he'd know not to try anything. I don't remember the name, I'm afraid, but he was foreign. Indonesian, I think, or Samoan. I expected the meeting to be after dark in some dingy dockyard, but as it turned out, they'd arranged to meet at the Three Greyhounds pub in Soho the following afternoon. I wanted to dress to intimidate, but I didn't really have any appropriate clothes, so I just wore a suit. As it turned out, I needn't have bothered. This overly generous antiques dealer was almost as big as I was, and unlike me, he looked like he could handle himself. He didn't even look at me when he entered the pub, almost deserted at that time on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat opposite Neil, while I stood awkwardly just outside their booth. They talked hurriedly and quietly to each other, and I couldn't make out many of the words, though it seemed like they were just discussing the price of the syringe. Eventually I saw a couple of briefcases exchange hands, and that was it. The dealer got up and walked out, holding a suitcase that seemed much lighter than the one he'd come in with. Neil gave me a relieved nod and headed back to the lab with his own suitcase, that I can only assume was full of cash. This is when things started to go wrong. When things started to get weird. I don't know if it had anything to do with Neil selling that syringe. I mean, I don't know how it could have, but that's when the trouble started. The first thing I noticed was the heat. Now, mozzies need to be kept at a temperature of around 23 to 24 degrees Celsius, which might not sound too hot, but at this point it was late May and we were starting to head towards summer, so on a sunny day the room where we kept the cages felt stifling. But as the days wore on, the heat started to seep out into the rest of the lab, till we were all coated with sweat for most of the day. We called the building manager to get the heating checked, and he told us everything was working fine. He even agreed to turn on the air conditioning for us, but it made no difference. The lab was warm and humid. Everything felt sticky. and I took to bringing in a change of shirt for when I left at the end of the day. Luckily, none of the chemicals we were mixing into the faux blood bags were particularly temperature sensitive, or God knows how much work we might have lost. But that was unpleasant, of course, but there was no real evidence of it being paranormal. No, that didn't come until a couple of weeks later. The mozzies started acting unusually. We kept them in metal mesh cages so they're viewable at all times. There's a hole in the front which is lined with gauze that can be gathered up to make a seal or allow you access to the cage. Normally they're happy enough to flit about their cages, but then, without warning, they stopped. They landed on the cage and just stayed there. They were distributed almost completely evenly over the inside, to the point where it almost looked regimented. And then they would stay like that for hours. It was unsettling, and more than once the researchers retrieved some for testing, looking for any change that might have resulted in this altered behavior, but everything came back normal. Sometimes, though, when I was working late, I'd look into that room, and I swear I would see a mass of mosquitoes in each cage, crowded in a thick clump around the gauze covering the entrance. I should have told somebody. At the time, I didn't know what I was seeing. The mosquitoes' attitudes towards the fake blood bags changed as well. Instead of meandering round, landing, feeding, flying off, feeding again, a few times. Now, as soon as the bag was placed inside, every mozzie in there would descend on it immediately, all at once, until the bag was completely covered in needle mouths and flitting wings. It genuinely started to scare me. What really scared me, and everyone else on the team, was what came out of the blood bag afterwards. Shortly after they began exhibiting this behavior, one of the other research assistants, George Larson, was retrieving one of the empty bags and returning it for disposal in the lab, and he stumbled, and it fell to the floor. When it hit the ground with a moist thud, it became immediately clear that the bag was not as empty as it had first appeared. The blood substitute, the hemoglobish, was a clear, syrupy orange, almost like dark honey, but slightly thinner. What oozed out of the bag now was a deep, cloudy red. At this point, nobody objected to calling in a biohazard. They took samples of the substance and put us through a basic decontamination, and then I went home. Odd to think now that my thoughts back then were full more of curiosity than of fear. The tests came back and were as alarming as they were impossible. It was blood. Real blood. O negative and infected with malaria. Not just malaria though, but yellow fever, hepatitis B, and signs of cholera. There were other substances in the sample as well that they were unable to identify. We were all told that we were to be quarantined immediately and that our project was shut down until further notice. I remember standing there in the lab as they said this. I heard a strangled cry from behind me and turned around to see Neil, shaking his head over and over, his face a mask of rage and hatred. He wasn't looking at the people who had come to quarantine us, though. No, he was looking at the room full of mosquitoes, as though they had planned this, as though it was purely through their malicious intent that he was watching his career burn to nothing. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran into the mosquito room. God knows what he was hoping to achieve. Spray a few cages to death in some petty act of revenge, maybe? He never got the chance. As he fumbled with the release mechanism, a tremendous buzzing filled the air. And suddenly I realized what they had been doing clustered around the gauze those nights. There was no time to pull Neil out, so I did the only thing I could. I shut the door. Thousands of mosquitoes erupted from those cages, far more, I thought, than we could possibly have had on site. There was no way to count them, though, as they swarmed onto poor Neil, first his hands and his face, then beneath his clothes, until there was no part of him not covered with the things. He swatted at them, killing some, but there were just too many. And after a few seconds, it was clear he was going into shock. He tried to scream, but that just gave them more places to drink from. That was when I turned away. There hadn't been a single drop of blood spilled, but we all knew that Dr. Neil Thomas was dead. after that. There was a lot of shouting and a lot of noise, then tests, confused and worried academics asking me questions that of course I couldn't answer. It was almost a month before the world was in focus again. The faculty have been alright to me actually, so I should probably be thankful. They were so keen to get this swept neatly under the rug that they just let me go. With such a glowing reference that I just walked into a lab tech position at King's College. It's mostly helping students, but that's alright. I think I'm done with research. Statement ends. Can't stand mosquitoes. Horrible things. Any solution to the issue of malaria that doesn't concentrate on wiping them out is not one that I have much time for. Still, this grotesque account doesn't give us many leads to follow. Obviously, there's the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine itself, but Tim's investigation yielded little significant information. Apparently those staff who've been around long enough to remember the event either didn't know the details or have been well briefed to keep their mouths shut. Aside from the fact that Dr. Neil Thomas died in a lab accident on the 30th May 2010, there's little more to be found. Sasha managed to get a copy of the inquest report, which is infuriatingly vague but does list the cause of death as blood loss, and the official verdict as death by misadventure. I don't think there can be much doubt that the antiques dealer is the curious Mr. Salesa. He's now turned up enough that I can no longer write it off as a coincidence, and have been having a word with Rosie about whether we can make contact with him. Apparently he hasn't been seen for almost 2 years now, with rumours in the trade running to everything from he had a quiet retirement to he's trying to dodge a jail sentence, or even he was shot dead in Colombia for stealing a priceless artifact from a drug lord. Whatever the reason, it doesn't look like he'll be answering questions anytime soon, though I have urged Rosie to keep trying. Aside from that, there's little more we can do with this statement. Mr. Neal himself passed away last year. Martin hasn't been able to get a hold of the official cause of death, but judging by the number of antibiotics the police report list as being at his home at the time, it must have been something very nasty indeed. End recording. Supplemental. I've been doing some digging into Tim, watching him. He's certainly doing his job far better than I'd have expected given his recent experiences. There's just one thing I don't understand. Why is he working for the Institute? A first in anthropology from Trinity College, 5 successful years spent climbing the ladder at a major publishing house, and then out of the blue he decides to come work for us. Why? I can't find any other indication of an interest in the paranormal, nothing to indicate this area of study appealed to him. Why stay after everything that happened with Prentice? Is it just loyalty, or could it be something?
Hey, I just wanted to check if you wanted a cup of tea. Sorry, are you recording? I thought you were done for the day.
I am. It's,
Why do you have pictures of Tim?
It's a performance review thing, going over some files for it.
That looks like a picture of his
Confidential files that legally you shouldn't really be looking at them. Please leave,
right.
Martin.
Did you want that tea?
No, thank you, Martin. I need to find a better place to do these recordings. End supplemental.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 46, Literary Heights.
Statement of Herbert Knox regarding a repeat customer to his bookshop in Chichester. Original statement given December 21st, 1998. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. It's hard to know exactly where to begin when explaining to you what exactly it was that I experienced. There were many things that happened, each strange and inexplicable in and of itself, but I'll be damned if I can see how they connect to each other, except that they all ended up involving the same student from the university. His name was Michael Crew, though he normally went by Mike, at least to me. I'm not usually one to pay much attention to the students that come into my shop, especially during the start of a new school year. I have something of a soft spot for the antique when it comes to my furnishings, and that, combined with the age of my stock, means that when new students arrive at the university, they generally regard the discovery of Lion Street books as something of a curiosity. I've heard more than one comparison to that shop in Stephen King's Needful Things, or whatever it was called. Anyway, as I deal mostly in rare books and antiquities, they generally get one look at the prices and suddenly their interest dries up. Of course, there are always a couple of rich kids whose parents weren't able to buy their way into Oxbridge, so it's not a complete waste. So it's rare that I have any cause to remember the face of my student customers. But Mike struck me the moment he walked into my shop. This would have been last September. I don't remember the exact date, though I'm sure if I looked up my receipts I could tell you. He was short, barely over 5 feet, and very thin. Underfed, I remember thinking. It hadn't yet turned cold, but he wore a high-collared coat and a thick scarf wrapped around his neck. Now I'm getting on in years, and much as I love my shop, the building can get a bit drafty come autumn, so I generally have the heating up quite high. It was clearly enough for him to become uncomfortable wrapped up like that, and he removed the scarf to reveal a branching pattern of white scar tissue arcing up the side of his neck. That was interesting, certainly, but it wasn't what actually caught my eye. No, what struck me most was that, rather than wonder or curiosity, as I would see in the faces of the other students who found their way into Lion Street books, this young man began scanning the shelves with an expression that seemed more like impatience. He was clearly looking for something specific, so after a few minutes I asked him if I could help. Without looking up, he said he was after a copy of de Plance's Dictionnaire Infernal, the older the better. I only had a 1908 translation in stock, but I said I would make inquiries if he wished for an older edition. He didn't reply to this, nor to my casual inquiry as to whether he was studying demonology or the occult. He took it to my desk to buy it, and I started rooting around for the credit card machine, and I smelled the strangest thing. It was like just before a storm breaks, that sharp smell in the air, but looking outside the sky was clear and the sun was shining. Mike seemed to smell it too, and he went very still. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wad of cash. He quickly counted it out, grabbed the book, and was through the door before I even had a chance to ring him up a receipt. The smell faded as soon as he was out of sight. I didn't know his name at that point, but it was far from the last time I saw him. He became something of a regular. Maybe once every 3 weeks or so he'd come in and check any new stock I had. He was interested in spiritualism, history of witchcraft, anything mystical, especially from before 1850. He also bought a few books on meteorology, especially pre-Enlightenment, and once a book on the work of Gottfried Leibniz, though I don't remember the title. I have no idea where he was getting his money, but he had a lot of it. He was able to pay 5 figures for a copy of a 1559 printing of the Malleus Maleficarum without breaking a sweat. At some point I learned his name. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have described him as a friend, or even close, but over the last year he'd easily been my most regular customer. That wasn't the only time I smelled that acrid tang in the air, though. Sometimes when he was in there, it would come again all at once. It never seemed to be coming from Mike, exactly, but when he was around, the smell would just suddenly be there. It was the only time I would ever smell it inside, and when I did, Mike would just stop whatever he was doing and leave immediately. He wouldn't run. He'd just leave. There was another thing, too. Whenever he was in, the light bulbs in my shop would burn brighter. I didn't even realize this until he'd been coming for several months, as it was usually in daylight when he went shopping. But when winter made its presence known, his late afternoon visits began to take place after dark, and I noticed that whenever he came in, the shop got brighter. The bulbs would start to buzz very softly, and the elements within them would glow with a surprising intensity. There was this strange electric crackling. Once I even got a shock when I turned a lamp on. I never brought it up with Mike, though. I don't even know how I would have gone about bringing it up. It was February when I got the Leitner book. I'd heard of him before, of course, though I'd never met the man. The rare book trade is a comparatively small world, at least within the UK, and his name would often come up whenever I was gossiping with my peers. Sometimes it was about which valuable piece he'd snatched for a fraction of its true value, or the ridiculous amounts he'd paid for a book that everyone else was sure was a fake. Occasionally there were more unsavory rumors about his personal life. So, even though I'd never personally made his acquaintance, I was well aware of Jürgen Leitner and his collection. And when he disappeared in 1994, I was one of the many that heard whispers on the grapevine that a few of his books were back in circulation. I never thought I'd actually get my hands on one, though. Not until I heard about Kirsten's death. Kirsten Baumann was a book dealer friend of mine down in Salisbury. I suppose you could call her a rival in some ways, but we'd always been very friendly. In fact, there were a few years back in the 80s when we were very friendly indeed. But we hadn't spoken much in the last year or two. Well, in January of this year she passed away, lost balance on the stairs and broke her neck. To be honest, I wasn't as surprised by her death as I might have been, though it was rather alarming. Over the last few years, the landscape of the UK rare books trade has changed significantly. A lot of the big names in the old guard have gone missing or retired, or sometimes even been found dead. The police even got involved for a while, as there was talk of maybe someone out there targeting booksellers, but they never found anything to indicate it was anything other than a coincidence. I suppose it's just an example of how one generation inevitably makes way for the next, but Kirsten was the first time it had affected someone I knew well. What surprised me more than her death, however, was that she had made me her literary executor, and left me the vast majority of her stock. So it was I came into the possession of a Leitner. It was a strange one, all right. Exaltiora, or From the Heights, was the name. It was custom bound in the late 1800s from what I could see, though the pages looked to be significantly older than that, 17th century I would have said. It was written in Latin, and seemed to be a long poem in the style of Virgil, illustrated with some quite striking woodcuts. It told the tale of a small, unnamed town high on a cliff top that sees a monstrous creature begin to approach. The poem is unclear whether it is a beast, a demon, or a god, as it uses the words interchangeably, but it is seen far off, its head and body lost among the clouds. The majority of the story details the villagers' attempts to prepare to do battle against this creature, but each time they devise a countermeasure, the thing gets closer and is shown to be far larger than previously suspected, rendering their preparations insignificant. At last, when it is almost upon them, its impossible vastness undeniable, the villagers surrender to despair and hurl themselves from the cliff top onto the rocks far below. It was a strange book, and made all the stranger by the fact that it appeared to be utterly unique. I could find no record of it in any catalogue I had available, and after a few calls to a couple of museums and archives I knew dealt with similar texts, I was convinced that this may well have been a completely unique book. This didn't please me as much as you might imagine, because what it meant was that I had an artifact on my hands, one that belonged far more in a museum than it did in a library. I'd only had a museum-worthy book come once before. The process of authentication and the work involved in selling it had quite frankly not been worth the amount that I sold it for. Museums are not as well funded as private collectors. Beyond that, there was something about the book itself that unsettled me. Reading it was disorientating, in a way that I can't easily put into words, especially the woodcuts, although they were just the village, or the cliffs, or empty forests or mountains. They were quite crude in many ways, but certainly not unsettling, and yet twice when reading it and observing the woodcuts, I fell off my chair. Over the week I possessed it, I had enough dizzy spells that I had to book an appointment with my doctor, although at the time I didn't make any direct connection between them and the book. I had bad dreams as well. I don't recall them with any clarity, but I'm rather sure they were dreams of falling. Mike came in at the end of that week. I wouldn't go so far as to say I was expecting him, but I'd put a half-dozen books to one side for his consideration, as I assumed he'd be in at some point soon. As was his habit, he said almost nothing, and the cold February air was enough that he didn't even feel the need to remove his scarf, so only the faintest hints of that branching scar could be seen creeping out from below it. The bulbs crackled and brightened in his presence, and I presented the books I had chosen to him. He spent some minutes looking through them before pushing them back with a shake of the head. This was not unusual for him, I took it as no insult. I turned to put them back on the shelf, and I was almost overcome by a wave of dizziness. I gripped the back of my chair and steadied myself. When I looked back at Mike, he was staring at the Leitner book with a wild expression I had never seen on his face before. He pointed at Ex Altiora and asked me how much it was. I started to tell him it wasn't for sale, but he had this look in his eyes, this furious desperation. It scared me, to be honest, and I had a sudden sense that this man was willing to kill me for that book. All this, combined with the discomfort I felt with the thing anyway, was just a bit too much for me. I named a figure that I thought was maybe double what it was actually worth, and Mike wrote me out a check so fast that I thought his pen would go clean through the paper. For this, I insisted on ringing him up a receipt, and without another word he was out into the rainy February afternoon. And that would have been it. Given what happened next, I don't think I would ever have seen Michael Crewe again if it wasn't for the simple fact that his check bounced. I didn't quite believe it at first. He'd always been so willing to drop huge amounts of money on books that the idea of him not being able to afford something had never quite registered. But there was no mistake. After no small amount of consideration, I decided that the only decent thing to do was to actually go to him and discuss the matter. Maybe I could get the book back. Maybe I could make alternate arrangements. Either way, I felt like I owed it to Mike. I had his address on file from a delivery he had requested a couple of months back, so it was a simple matter to close up the shop early and make the short walk across Chichester to his flat. Rather lavish by student standards, but easy enough to find. The sky was a bruised grey as I walked across town, and I was glad I had thought to bring my umbrella, as it was promising to be a storm. I recognized the smell from Mike's previous visits, though even then I didn't realize what it meant. I reached his door and knocked. I was careful to be firm, but not aggressive in my knocking, as I had an odd conviction that an overly confrontational knock would have made it much harder to retrieve the book. I needn't have given it any thought at all. The door opened before I'd even finished knocking, and I had the oddest feeling in my stomach, as though I was standing on the edge of a great drop, and I took an instinctive step back. Mike stood there, looking terrible. From inside came the odour of a man who has not left the room or opened a window for some days. Strewn across the floor were pages and pages of scrawled Latin text, which alarmed me until I saw the unharmed and whole book clutched in his arms. I started to explain what had happened and why I was there, but he didn't seem to be registering my words, just staring blankly at the space I occupied as though he didn't notice I was standing there. I remember I had just about reached the point of repeating the word check over and over in the hopes he acknowledged it, when the first droplets of rain began to hit his window. Without warning, Mike's eyes went wide in what might have been realization or maybe just fear, and his face got so pale his branching scar seemed almost to vanish. Then the first peal of thunder rolled over us, and that smell hit me with such an intensity I could barely breathe. I was on the floor before I knew what was happening and turned to see Mike running full pelt down the corridor, clutching the Leitner book. I must have hit my head, and my thinking was very muddled, but I was convinced he was trying to escape with the book. With a determination that, quite frankly, I never would have expected from myself, I decided that I had to stop it. I had to stop Michael Crewe from stealing my Leitner. So I got up, umbrella forgotten, and chased him out into the pouring rain. We weaved our way through Chichester, lightning arcing through the sky in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in the 40 years I lived there. I could just about make out the fleeing figure of Mike in front of me, and sometimes, When the lightning lit the sky, I could have sworn I saw someone else chasing him. It was hard to make out, as it only seemed to appear for those momentary flashes, but it seemed tall, thin, its limbs angular and branching, like Mike's scar. I don't know how he got into the bell tower for Chichester Cathedral. It stands separate from the main building, tall, imposing and square, starkly illuminated by the flashing sky. One of the doors at the base stood open, and I didn't stop to think how it had been opened before dashing inside and starting up the stairs. The smell was so thick inside I gagged on the acrid stench. In my determination to chase a young man stealing a book, I had apparently completely forgotten my age, which returned all at once, and I collapsed slightly on the stairs. I began to climb then, slowly, towards the top of the bell tower. I have never been afraid of heights, but as I got higher and higher up those stairs, my head started to swim and my heart was beating so fast I was honestly worried that I was in danger of a heart attack. Finally, I reached the top flight of stairs. I could hear shouting from the bell room. It was Mike. He was screaming something that sounded like a chant or a prayer. Most of it was in languages I didn't know, but I could make out the words Altiora, Vertigo, and the Vast. I reached the top, and there I saw Mike standing before an open window. He held the book before him like a protective ward, and in front of him was a strange, branching figure. It crackled and fizzed, lit by a strobing white light as though the lightning was within the room itself. It was just standing there like it couldn't approach, as Mike reached the crescendo of his invocation, and with a cry of "I am yours," he leapt through the open window, and presumably to his death. The strange figure cried out, a sound like tearing sandpaper, and seemed to be dragged through the window with him. The sharp smell vanished instantly, and I was alone in the dark. I say presumably about his jumping almost 100 feet to his death, because when I went out, I could find no body at the base of the tower, and neither could the police, who obviously treated me like a lunatic. When the sky cleared shortly afterwards, it became apparent that all the windows to the bell chamber were closed and sealed. I never saw Michael Crew or the Lightner book again. Statement ends. Michael Crew. Another name that seems to crop up more than once in relation to Lightners, and twice regarding this particular volume. The events here seem to have taken place a couple of years after those of Statement 9991006. Could his exposure to the Bone Turner's tale have catalyzed an interest in Jürgen Lightner? Or perhaps an early experiment? It seems as though he was attempting to use the book as protection against whatever was chasing him. Did the Bone Turner's tale not work in that regard? And what was it that chased him, bringing that smell with it? It is a shame that Ex Altiora was burned in the end. I would have been fascinated to read it, especially as there is one feature that I'm surprised Mr. Knox did not mention, comparing his statement to that of Dominic Swain in 0132806. The book Mr. Knox received did not seem to have a woodcut of the dark night sky, with the branching, arching design of the Lichtenberg figure. End recording. Supplemental. Someone else has been going down into the tunnels. When I came in yesterday, I noticed that the trapdoor appeared to have been disturbed. It was unlocked. I confronted the others, but they all deny it, of course. Someone must think there is more down there of value, unless they're trying to hide something. Searching or hiding, it could be either. I might try to set up a camera to watch the trapdoor, if I can find somewhere effective to hide it. I did go down there to see if I could find anything, but it seems much as it did last time. The only difference now is all the spider webs. They seem to have spread down there. I think I saw some of the larger specimens actually eating the remains of the worms. It was a disconcerting sight, and I left almost immediately. End supplemental.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 47, The New Door.
Statement of Helen Richardson regarding, how would you describe it? Miss Richardson?
What?
Your experience, how would you summarize it?
Well, I've been trying to draw you a map, but it doesn't work.
Right. Statement of Helen Richardson regarding a new door in the house she was selling. Statement recorded direct from subject, 2nd October 2016. Statement begins. Miss Richardson?
There's no left turns. Look, none. It just turns right. It doesn't make any sense. No, it wasn't a spiral because you could also go forward. I mean, I did mostly just forward, and the paths never got shorter. Like you were coming to a centre, they just kept going. It doesn't make any sense. Look at it.
Miss
Look at it.
You're right. This map doesn't make any sense.
After a few turns.
It becomes a mess of impossible lines. Yes, but it will be very useful for our investigation if you could start at the beginning. Give us some context. Tell me how it got started.
What do you want to know? There wasn't a door, and then there was. I worked for Wilburton Kendrick. I still do, I suppose. I haven't officially quit, but I haven't been back there since this happened. We mostly sell properties around the Wimbledon area, sometimes as far out as Collier's Wood. We specialise in well-appointed family homes for successful professionals looking to move further out of London. We've had a lot of success, and these days usually have anything up to 200 properties on the market. Most of them are detached family homes or big, well-appointed flats. I've been with the agency for about 8 years now, and I've done thousands of viewings for them, so believe me when I say there was nothing unusual about that house on St Albans Avenue. I mean, maybe the fact the owner was selling it for less than $2 million, even though it still wasn't suspiciously cheap. It was just a lovely house in a good area, like every other house I sell. When I think back to driving there, the trees seem darker than they should have been. The other houses sit there, sinister, behind their tall gates and empty driveways. But I think, it's just my memory changing to fit what I know now. At the time, I don't think I felt anything except annoyance that I was going to be 2 minutes late to the viewing. You know what's funny? Even after everything that happened, I actually have trouble picturing the house in my mind. It was so much like all the others, so unremarkable, and it's not like I've been back. For most of the morning viewing, it was business as usual. I had the usual stream of bankers and executives asking the standard questions, occasionally livened up by a private dentist or a barrister. I walked around that house for the better part of 5 hours, and by the end I'd been in every room and opened every cupboard dozens of times. And I promise you, I swear to you, that door was not there. He came at the end of the viewings. It was the last appointment, and although he didn't give his name, I am absolutely sure he was not Mr. and Mrs. Adrian Lombardi. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and he had long, straw-coloured hair that fell onto his shoulders and loose ringlets. His face was round and unthreatening, although he stood so still when I answered the door. It did rather unnerve me. I asked him if he was Mr. Lombardi, and he said no, but that Mr. Lombardi wouldn't be coming, so he was here instead. It's not unheard of for some of our clients to send their people to viewings in their place, so it didn't seem like an unreasonable statement, even if it would normally, be arranged ahead of time. I just thought I'd missed an email. I held out my arm for a handshake. but he just looked at it and laughed, keeping his hands firmly by his side. That was when I first started to think that something might be wrong, because his laugh didn't sound right. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't a human laugh. I should have stopped there and left, or called the police, but he'd already walked past me and into the house, and I'd started to give him the sales pitch, almost as a reflex. I decided that since he didn't seem to be actively threatening, I'd just give him a quick rundown of the house and get out of there as soon as possible. He was strange, but I thought that if he did work for the Lombardis, that I didn't want to be rude and have to deal with a complaint later. So I took him round the place. He followed me. His eyes were always looking where I pointed, but he never seemed to take anything in, and he didn't ask any questions at all. At least not till we reached the second floor. We just climbed up the stairs to the top of the house. I went into the first bedroom and I started talking about its potential as a child's room or a study. The ceiling was quite low and I thought I'd best warn him to be careful, but when I looked back, he wasn't there. I stepped back out onto the landing to find him looking at a new door. He asked me what was behind it, and I just stood there, staring. It was a small, unremarkable door, painted dark yellow with a matte black handle, and it wasn't there before. I had been up on that landing dozens of times already, and I definitely did not remember it being there. It wasn't just that I hadn't noticed it. You have to understand that. It wasn't there. It couldn't have been there. I checked the floor plan I had with me, and obviously there was no door shown on it. It was an exterior wall on the second floor. There can't have been anything beyond it but empty air and a significant drop. Except that I had made several circuits of the outside while showing off the garden, and there was absolutely no door visible there. It was just a dark yellow door that couldn't be there. The man asked me again what was inside, and I just stood there, staring at it with my mouth hanging open in shock. I honestly don't know how long I stood there looking at it. My strange client said nothing, and I'd almost forgotten he was there by the time I finally made up my mind. I reached out and gripped the handle. It was warm. I turned it, and as soon as I did so, the door swung open. I didn't need to pull it at all. It opened slowly, but deliberately, like it was keen for me to go inside. And beyond that threshold, where there should have been empty air over the garden, there was a long, windowless corridor. It was lit by electric lamps attached to the walls every 10 feet or so, and the walls were papered over in a swirling green pattern. Running down the middle of the faded yellow carpet was a rug, black and thick, that disappeared off as the path very gradually curved to the left. On the walls were what at first looked like mirrors, but I soon realised that while a few of them were mirrors, most of them were paintings or photographs of that same corridor from various odd angles. Here's the thing. I don't remember going through that door. I remember standing there, looking down it with this feeling of dread. And then I remember feeling a surge of terror as I heard the door close behind me with a click. I spun round, but there was no handle on this side, just a huge, smooth mirror. I saw myself stood in that strange corridor. And it looked like I'd been crying for hours. I hammered, shouted, I threw myself against the uncaring face of that mirror, and nothing happened. It didn't even crack. I took out my phone. My mind was muddy, but I don't know exactly what I was hoping to do. Call the police, maybe? My colleagues? I think I might have wanted just to check the time. I had no idea how long I'd been in there. When I opened the phone, all that was on the screen was another picture of the corridor, just like the paintings on the walls. So I started walking down the corridor. I mean, there was nothing else I could do. It dragged on and on, bending almost imperceptibly to the left, while every once in a while there would be another corridor turning off to the right at a sharp angle. At first, I'd avoided these branching paths, thinking if I walked along the corridor far enough, it would have to lead somewhere. But after what felt like miles, I finally decided that taking one of the turns, it couldn't make things worse. The branching corridors were identical. Mirrors and paintings that mirrored them were everywhere. And when I turned back, I think I must have gotten turned around, because the left turn that would have led back towards the door wasn't there anymore. It was another long corridor with paths off to the right. The wallpaper was a different colour though, I think. It definitely changed, but I never noticed it switching. I'd simply realised that it hadn't been red when I'd been walking, or blue, or purple, or whatever colour it was at the time. All the colours seemed to shift in that place. Even the yellow of the carpet and the black of the rug. It felt like I couldn't trust my eyes. Based on the date of my appointment and the newspaper I found later, I think I was in there for 3 days. It was impossible to tell from inside, though. I don't remember sleeping or even feeling tired. I did spend a lot of time just slumped in despair, though, so maybe I slept then. I had no food or water. I got very delirious by the end. It didn't help, it was so warm in there. Although often seemed like I couldn't stop shivering, like I was cold. I was almost passed out from misery when I saw it. It was stood way off in the distance, a long way down the corridor. It seemed almost human from a distance. But as it got closer, I saw that it was anything but. Its body was thin and limp, and when it moved, it shifted, like I was watching it through rippling water. Its hands were swollen, and bits of them jutted out at annoying angles. It was moving towards me fast, and as I looked, I saw that all the pictures on the wall now showed this thing, although each distorted it differently, like a selection of funhouse mirrors. But all of them showed their hands as bulbous and sharp. I looked around in desperation, trying to find any hope of escape. The thing was getting closer and closer, and I could hear that weird laugh again. And then I saw it, a mirrored frame that did not contain the creature. I had no reason to think it would help, but I could see no other choice but waiting for death, so I threw myself at this empty mirror. And just like that, I was out. I felt the cold night air on my face and wet tarmac under my hands and knees. It was raining. It turned up in Dulwich of all places. I screamed for about 5 minutes before someone came to help me. I don't really know what else to tell you. I was hospitalised for a short while until they were satisfied my dehydration wasn't going to cause any complications. And I spent a long time at home, not opening any doors. Finally, after the latest bout of nightmares, I decided to come to you and tell you my story. Maybe you can make some sense of this.
Perhaps. Leave it with us. We'll do some digging and see what we can find.
You believe me then?
Yes. Yes, I think I do. One thing, though. You say you don't remember the man's name.
I think he told me, but I
It wasn't Michael, was it?
Yes. Michael! That was it. Do you know him?
Maybe. We'll make some inquiries and get back to you, Miss Richardson. Thank you for your time.
Right. Well, I'll just leave you to it then.
Sasha!
Sorry, did you call?
I just had a statement from someone claims they met your Michael.
Michael? The distorted Michael?
The very same. I don't think we re-recorded your statement on him, did we?
Did we need to?
It was one of the tapes that vanished during the attack.
Oh. Well, I can give it again if you'd like, but I haven't seen him since.
And you can't think of any further insights? Nothing you forgot to mention last time?
I don't think so, no.
What are you doing at the moment?
Reorganizing your discredited section. It's a bit of a mess. If I may say so, John, I feel you've been a bit less conscientious about it since you got back.
Oh, that's fair. Sorry. Let me know once you're finished. I'd very much like you on this case.
Yes, will do.
Do you even know they're lying to you?
I'm sorry, I didn't... Can I help you? This place is off limits.
I disagree.
Who let you in here?
Let. I'm afraid that isn't how this works.
You're him?
Yes,
Michael.
that is a real name.
Are you here to kill me?
No.
Why are you here?
I am simply collecting what is mine, Archivist. The one who enters my domain.
Miss Richardson? You own those hallways?
What a fascinating question. Does your hand in any way own your stomach? In any case, it doesn't matter. The Wanderer had a brief respite, but it's over now.
Well, you're too late. She's gone.
Yes. Did you notice which door she left through?
Yes. Wait. No, there was...
There has never been a door there, Archivist. Your mind plays tricks on you.
Let her go.
No?
Get her back here!
Are you going to attack me?
Ah! Who the hell are you?
I am not a who, Archivist. I am a what? A who requires a degree of identity I can't ever attain.
So, Michael isn't your real name?
There is no such thing as a real name.
What are you talking about?
I am talking about myself. It's not something I'm used to doing, so I'm sorry if I'm not very good at it.
You decided to appear down here and stab me anyway.
I wanted to talk to you. I intervened to save you before. I'm interested in what happens next.
Yes, well, thank you for that, I suppose. And you still haven't told me why you intervened at all.
I'm normally neutral, yes, but the loss of this place would have unbalanced the struggle too early. I'm keen to see how it progresses.
You make it sound like there's a war.
Then I will say nothing further. I wouldn't wish to tarnish your ignorance prematurely. Goodbye, Archivist.
Wait! Michael? Michael? End recording.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 48, Lost in the Crowd.